Hello, welcome to The Context with Martine Croxall in London.
And me, Katrina Perry, in Washington, where this hour we're focusing on President Trump's second term in office.
The markets are going to boom, the stock is going to boom, the country is going to boom, and the rest of the world wants to see, is there any way they can make a deal?
The president's actions will reverberate here in Canada and across the world. They are all unjustified, unwarranted, and in our judgment, misguided.
This is not just a short-term tactical exercise. It is the beginning of a new era.
Donald Trump has been using an intriguing metaphor today, comparing the American economy to a patient who's just had an operation, saying that it is now healing and will be getting bigger, stronger and better.
Joining us tonight, Doug Heye, former head of communications for the Republican National Committee, and Joel Rubin, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration.
Hello and welcome to the programme. Well, this hour every day we focus on President Trump's second term in office and what he's doing, how it impacts the US and the world. And what a day it's been once again. Now we're going to get into the details of that huge tariff announcement from the president shortly. But first, we want to bring you some developing news that's just happening here in the US. The Pentagon's Inspector General's office has announced that it's opening a probe into the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's use of an unclassified commercial texting app to coordinate a launch of US strikes on Yemen's Houthis, using the platform to share what many in the military and beyond consider to have been sensitive and mission-critical details.
The Signal chat made international headlines, you'll remember, when it was revealed that President Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, mistakenly added Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, to the chat group. A number of senior officials were involved, including Vice President J.D. Vance. The group, including Pete Hegseth, have come under intense criticism with calls for resignations. Here's what we've heard from the Defense Secretary last week.
Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Let's bring in our panel, Doug Heye and Joel Rubin. Thank you both for being with us. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about tariffs throughout the programme, but that big story from last week has reared its head again. Doug, is this investigation going to cause problems for Secretary Hegseth?
I think it could cause problems for him and multiple people who were, on that text chain. And ultimately, it's why the initial reaction of nobody did anything wrong and that's it and we're not going to answer any more questions to this is a very common communications blunder. The first thing you try and do is a diagnostic of what exactly happened, who did what, and get as much knowledge as you can. It was very clear when I saw these initial denials that there was going to be more to come. More plans that we saw ultimately Jeffrey Goldberg put out that were war plans. And we've heard more just in the past day or two on things that other people on that chain have done that weren't exactly secure. In communications, it's sort of simple sometimes. You figure out exactly what happened as best you can. You get all the information that you can, and then you respond. If you respond immediately, you will be caught either by surprise or in your unawares.
And Joel, what's your view? Is this going to be a problem, as Doug says there, for Pete Hegseth?
Yeah, Katrina, this is a big deal because what will now happen is that the Inspector General at the Pentagon will begin to ask for all kinds of records. And this is sort of like the tip of the iceberg. To Doug's point, an immediate denial did not do the Secretary any good at all. And I think what we'll end up finding out is that this Inspector General may begin with looking at this one Signal chat and then may begin to ask questions, well, what other Signal chats are there? How else do you communicate with your colleagues, with your subordinates about sensitive military operations? And the Inspector General has a lot of latitude here. Now, of course, my second thought after thinking this is a good thing was, oh, boy, this Inspector General is not long for the job because I wonder if they're going to get fired because that seems to be what President Trump likes to do whenever there's any oversight. But if this IG does stay in the job, I think this could become a cascading crisis for the Secretary of Defense.
Definitely one that we'll be watching closely in the days and weeks ahead. Now, as we said a moment ago, it's been a huge 24 hours. We're a day on from that announcement from President Trump announcing those sweeping global tariffs.
Yeah, there were warnings of retaliations, of trade wars and potential crises. And it all started with that speech yesterday.
April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
Well, here's a reminder of some of those key announcements in the White House Rose Garden on Wednesday. There will be a universal baseline tariff of 10% on all imports coming into the US. That's the rate that will be imposed on the United Kingdom. The European Union has been hit with a higher 20% tariff. Donald Trump imposed an additional 34% on China. That's on top of the 20% tariffs already announced.
Now, as we've been hearing throughout the day, markets are down. They've just closed here in the US. This is live on the New York Stock Exchange there. You can see just how the markets have closed there. President Trump was asked about that response from the markets to his tariffs a little earlier. This is what he said.
It was an operation, like when a patient gets operated on, and it's a big thing. I said this would exactly be the way it is. We have $6 or $7 trillion coming into our country, and we've never seen anything like it. The markets are going to boom, the stock is going to boom, the country is going to boom.
Now, in a moment, we will pull all of this apart with Doug and Joel. But first, let's just get reaction from our BBC team on the ground who've been following these developments. Our Central America correspondent, Will Grant, is in Mexico City, and our business correspondent, Erin Delmore, is in New York, where the markets have just closed. Erin, to you first. Talk to us about how the markets have responded. There's a big downward trajectory and a lot of red.
Absolutely, and the likes of this we have not seen since June 2020. That's where the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ are landing today, and of course that takes us back to the midst of the COVID pandemic. That tells you about what kind of crisis moment Wall Street is in right now. The Dow, for what it's worth, is down around 1,700 points. That's almost 4%, and the NASDAQ coming in almost 6% down. A massive sell-off, and President Trump said that this is like a patient being operated on. Well, right now then, what we're seeing in the building behind me, the New York Stock Exchange, is the bleeding. This is trillions of dollars wiped off of the U.S. stock market. And it's a big reaction to President Trump's announcement yesterday on tariffs, which came in deeper and bigger than traders were expecting. It's worth remembering, too, that stocks usually bumped. They initially bumped after President Trump's election, and that's on some of the things he mentioned in the campaign, like cutting regulation and cutting taxes, all things that are very business friendly. But instead, we're seeing this with businesses having a difficult reaction today, in addition to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks and months with plans to cut the government workforce, for instance, and plans to cut government spending as well. And so we do see shock today, big dips on Wall Street, the likes of which we have not seen in years.
Erin, for the moment, thank you. Will Grant in Mexico City. We heard from Claudia Sheinbaum earlier. I mean, what's the response been? Was it worse or better than they could have hoped for?
It's a little mixture of both, I think. On the one hand, she was quick to say that Mexico wouldn't be imposing any tariffs on the United States. And there was a slightly kind of victorious tone, if you like, in the sense that Mexico had been saved from the worst. Mexico already has a tariff regime with the United States related to controlling fentanyl smuggling into the US and the movement of undocumented immigrants north. And so that has sort of saved them from the other tariffs. But there are key parts of the Mexican economy that are still vulnerable, not least steel, aluminium, which we've heard about, but of course the car industry too. The automotive industry in Mexico is vital. It is the second largest supplier of car parts to the US. The biggest supplier, and one of the largest supplier of finished cars too. So it's vital, and the idea that quite a lot of that industry is going to be hurt. Now, the finance secretary said 84% of the industry falls falls under the free trade agreement between the three North American nations. But there's a lot of grey area where things don't come under that agreement, particularly car parts. So they're going to have to work out the knots and the detailing exactly what's in there. And we've already seen the knock-on effect in the fact that Stellantis, car manufacturer that owns Dodge, for example, hugely important here in Mexico, is shuttering its plant in Toluca for the entire month of April. So already a ripple effect on people's jobs, people's lives, and car production here.
Will, thank you very much. Will Grant in Mexico City, and Erin, thank you too for joining us on Wall Street. Well, let's bring our panel back in. Doug Heye and Joel Rubin, we're going to spend a bit of time now just getting your first thoughts on that international reaction today. Doug, everybody was bracing themselves because so little information had come out in advance.
Yeah, very little came out, and very little was distributed amongst members of Congress, Republican members. Obviously, they weren't going to leak anything to Democrats. Even within the White House, there were a lot of people who didn't know what was going to be announced until it all happened. And I can tell you, I was getting emails from London, from Italy, from Germany, from all over Europe, a couple from Asia as well, asking what this would be. I certainly didn't know as well, but now we do know. And what we know is that these impacts, these traditionally have been Republican warnings against tariffs. That's how much the party has changed. But that it's going to have an impact not just on what things cost, but potentially on American jobs. And so I think of my friend Giampaolo Veneca, who makes wine in the Collio region of northeast Italy. And his price will go up, but he also works with American importers, American distributors, retailers, restaurateurs. People have to deliver those wines into restaurants and retail locations in North Carolina and Colorado, Washington State, wherever that may be. Those ultimately are American jobs. And as we see those costs go up, that could have an impact on people in those industries where they could be laid off. That's a real challenge for this administration, that possibility.
And Joel, it's not just American jobs, it's American wealth as well. I mean, when we look at what's been wiped off the US stock markets today, so many Americans have their life savings and effective pension fund in those stock markets. How much pain do you think people will bear, or the president and the wealthy individuals around him will be able to bear as well?
Yeah, Katrina, this is sort of like an economic war against the world and against the American people's pocketbooks. To your point, if President Trump is saying we're going to be made wealthy, well, let's first find how we can recoup those couple $1 trillion lost today on the markets that are directly going to impact Americans' retirement and long-term savings. And then you add to that the potential price shock of higher prices at stores, buying cars, getting groceries. It's a real major negative economic jolt to the American people. And so, I think he has a lot of ground to make up now. It's one thing to announce from the Rose Garden a big new policy and shock the world. It's another thing to see it implemented effectively. And what are the plans for making sure that manufacturing does get onshore, does come here, that we have the dollars to invest here in the United States? And how long is that going to take? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? There's really nothing laid out in what the president said. So he may want to take out punishment against the world, but in the near term, it's going to be punishment against the American people. And I think that's going to really shrink the kind of space, to your point, politically speaking, that he has. You can't live in the near term forever when the near term is going to be very painful.
Doug, just one quick thought from you about who wasn't on the list. Russia, Belarus, North Korea, to name but three. The White House says, well, they're under sanctions, we don't need tariffs. But what sort of signal does that send to other countries which are meant to be friends?
Look, I think we've been sending signals to our allies that have been troubling, not just over the past few months, but over the past few years now. And I say that having been in the UK embassy and the French embassy here in Washington, there have been questions about what America's relationship is, not just with Europe, but with the world at this point. This really speaks to that.
We'll dig into that issue of American relations with its friends and foes in just a moment. Do stay with us. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
This program asks plain questions with the help of the unrivaled range of BBC journalists right across the world, and gathered here in this building. I'll also draw on my frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to. Meaning our analysis is objective, unbiased, and I promise you, with absolutely no spin. That's why we call our program Unspun World.
On BBC News.
Global food prices are on the up again. But why? And what impact will President Trump's trade war have on the price we pay for essentials? We'll hear from the UN, a huge global restaurant group, and the boss of the brewing giant Heineken this week on Talking Business here on BBC News.
Welcome back now. While the message from the whole Trump team today has been one of optimism, positivity and even excitement about what was announced yesterday, industries across this country are not in agreement. In particular, the agriculture sector knows the impact of retaliatory tariffs all too well. You may remember back in March, China imposed 15% tariffs on goods like chicken, wheat and cotton, and 10% tariffs on vegetables, dairy products and soybeans.
Well, as the global trading system feels the shock of the announcement and the uncertainty ahead, what now for these industries? Let's get the latest from on the ground in Kentucky. We can speak to Caleb Ragland, a farmer from the town of Magnolia. He's also president of the American Soybean Association. Caleb, thank you for joining us here on The Context. What was your reaction when you heard this announcement from President Trump on Wednesday?
Well, as a soybean farmer, we're definitely concerned when our markets are threatened. The U.S. exports right at 50% of all of the soybeans that are grown in the United States. And anytime something is done that hurts our opportunities to export our soybeans, we're concerned. And the tariffs that have been announced, the EU, China, those are of particular concern. Of the 50% of our exports, right at half of those exports go to China. And we have a precedent from the previous trade war that started in 2017. We have lost market share we've never regained. And that is concerning, and we don't need a repeat of that.
You have voted for Donald Trump on a number of occasions, so you'll have been aware that he was going to impose tariffs. Do you regret voting for him now that he's done this because of the damage he's going to do to you and your industry?
Well, there's many things that come into deciding who to vote for. President Trump has a lot of good goals for our country, reducing regulation, reducing taxes, trying to create business-friendly environments. But when it comes to trade, we would like to encourage the president to look for opportunities to break down barriers instead of build walls. Ways that we could break down those barriers would be some new trade agreements. The phase one trade agreement that he made with China a few years ago had a lot of potential. Let's get a phase two deal done. Let's look to update the USMCA agreement with China, with Canada and Mexico. That has created some great opportunities for farmers. So we believe that tariffs could be a tool in the short term, but they don't need to be something that outside negotiation ends up making us uncompetitive, because we've lost market share to Brazil in particular. They have partnered more with China in recent years, and we need to keep our export markets. They're vital for the success of soybean farmers.
How much time does President Trump have to strike these deals that you're talking about before the damage to your industry, your sector, is irreversible?
Well, we need to get something done sooner than later. The ag economy in the U.S. is already in a bit of a tough spot, and there's not a lot of room for error. In 2017, the ag economy was much stronger. For example, the commodity price for soybeans is about 40% lower than it was just 3 years ago. And farmers are really struggling right now. So we're already hurting, and we don't need to see a further dip in our prices in the long term. And we have confidence that the president and his administration know the importance of agriculture to the economy of the United States, and that they will get some trade deals done. But we need something to happen sooner than later, because we're bleeding, and we don't want to bleed out.
Just a final thought from you, though. This isn't just about export markets that are available to you, is it? How concerned are you about the rising costs that businesses in your sector are going to face because of these tariffs?
It's certainly a concern. I think it's a bit of a secondary concern compared to the loss of markets, but increases in production cost, whether it be equipment, whether it be fertilizer, are also at top of mind for us. I will commend the president that currently there is not going to be tariffs on potash that comes from Canada. That was a major concern. So that is one bright spot in all of this. But certainly cost of production are higher than they've ever been when you put everything together. And lower commodity prices and higher costs is a recipe for failure for the agriculture economy or the economy of any industry long term. So we've got to find a way to get our commodity prices up, and I have hopes that some promising trade deals are just around the corner that will help the ag economy and soybeans in particular.
Caleb Ragland, President of the American Soybean Association, joining us from Kentucky. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Well, our panel, Doug High and Joel Rubin, are still with us. They're really interesting listening to Caleb there when he said he would like President Trump to break down barriers instead of building walls on trade, calling for trade deals to be done. Doug, traditionally, this area has kind of been the preserve of Congress, rubber stamping any trade deals. And we've seen today a bipartisan bill put forward calling on Congress to have to approve the increase in any tariffs. Has the president completely bypassed basically the elected representatives here?
Sure, he has. And, this doesn't come in a vacuum. I think what we've seen over the past, not just few years, but generations at this point, is basically a Congress, every Congress, Republican Congress or Democratic Congress, that's essentially ceded just a little bit every year of its Article I responsibilities and powers that have made George W. Bush more powerful, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, and now Donald Trump again. It has empowered Trump to do what he has done today and yesterday. And we know that Donald Trump has wanted to do things like this. So he is able to do this, in fact, because he's standing on the shoulders of what Congress has done or failed to do over generations now. And it should be a very stark warning for Congress, Republican or Democrat, that your Article I powers have been usurped because you've given them away.
But Doug, do you see members of Congress, actually Republicans, lending their support to this bipartisan bill and trying to get back some of that power you say they've given away?
Well, some certainly have, and we've seen some of the Republican senators who voted, obviously, on that measure yesterday. Some Republicans in the House will. The House politics are much more different because of how district lines are drawn, what that means for primaries, and so forth. Donald Trump has a much stronger hold on House Republicans than he does on Senate Republicans because of that. Only 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. Every Republican, every Democrat in the House is up every 2 years. That makes the politics of this very different. We'll see some that'll stand up and talk about this. If the pain becomes stronger, we'll see more, but it's not clear that that's going to reach critical mass anytime soon.
Joel, this was supposed to be the president that was going to bring down costs for voters and address the fact that life is very, very expensive. How is he going to sell this idea to consumers, do you think, that these are good measures even though they're going to feel some pain?
Well, he's going to sell it by saying we're already in the golden age now, and he's going to try to use whatever kind of rhetorical gymnastics he can to make people think that they're better off than they actually are. Look, when it comes to trade, Americans generally have been very skeptical of it, and we have not seen a trade deal go through in a number of years that has had strong support. I remember when I served in the Obama administration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was blocked and did not move forward as an idea for a broad trade agreement. But so what's going to happen here is that instead of talking about trade, we're now going to talk about costs. We're now going to talk about pain. We're going to talk about stock market price volatility, and we're going to talk about pocketbook issues. And he just hasn't taken on inflation as an issue, and now he's adding to costs for regular Americans. And it's going to be very hard for him to talk ahead of the actual wallet experience of everyday Americans.
Doug, just a quick question to you. I mean, it takes time to build factories, manufacturing plants, to bring that production home. I mean, he could be out of office, couldn't he, before some of these places are in effect?
Sure, and I grew up in North Carolina, not far from textile country, and it takes time to bring some of those factories and facilities back, even if they essentially are just lying fallow. That's a challenge here for this administration, especially because in the meantime, so much of what's made in a textile fashion, whether those are shirts or socks or suits or what have you, or upholstery, that's going to come at a higher cost, which means Americans are going to start feeling this fairly soon if a deal, or multiple deals aren't cut in short order.
Still much to discuss, not just about tariffs, but also TikTok. And Marco Rubio has been in Europe talking to NATO members. Wonder what sort of reception he got there. Plenty more still to come on The Context with Katrina and me. Stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello there. There's a lot to talk about in Europe at the moment. If we start off across the western Mediterranean, it's stormy with an area of low pressure bringing some wet and increasingly windy weather across Portugal and Spain. That's going to gradually clear away. A good slice of fine, dry, sunny and warm weather across Central Europe, but it has been pretty stormy of late across Greece, and still we are likely to see some showers across mainland Greece, down into the islands and also across to Turkey as well. A quieter setup across much of Italy and into France. There's that wetter weather I've already pointed out into Spain and Portugal. But some spring sunshine and warmth, 24 degrees, very pleasant in Paris. That extends up into the Low Countries and to Germany. Scandinavia seeing some sunshine as well. However, we're likely to see a cold northerly wind driving a weather front further south, and that will turn the rain to snow across parts of Poland, down into Russia and Ukraine over the next few days. Out to the west, the rain starts to ease away through Iberia, a quieter, improving picture. So let's take a look at the city forecast then. Some spring sunshine and warmth continuing for London and Paris. A little bit fresher in Barcelona, but certainly drying up. Now, out to the east, we will continue to see that cold story with some snow showers are likely in Kyiv, improving elsewhere.
I kind of didn't really get why people were so freaked out by what I was doing, but I also liked it. I understood even then it was just clothes.
Ritual and living tradition are really significant here in Bulgaria, and that's important because we don't need all of this, but somehow it matters.
Subtitles have become something that is not a barrier, and I think that to me has been such an amazing gift.
We underestimate our need to be in spaces where we celebrate life. And it's so important that working class kids can get access to that.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC News.
In the world of business, everything is connected. From global hubs to places less traveled. The big stories to your bottom line. The path can be unpredictable. But with the right insights, you can see where the bend in the road will lead. Business on BBC News. Make the connection.
Ukraine is just about holding the front here, while the Russians have launched this fresh assault.
Everywhere you look, there are uprooted trees, there are bits of building, and the destruction is just in every direction.
Incendiary drones were dropped here. We know this was the military junta because the rebels don't have that kind of weaponry.
When you can hear the tear gas canisters being lobbed at the protesters.
There, when the story breaks, BBC News.
Join Americast as we navigate the biggest news and politics in the US.
With lively chats about what's happening in America
and social media investigations.
Travel to the heart of America.
With Americast, listen wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello and welcome back. You're watching The Context with me, Katrina Perry, in Washington.
And I'm Martine Croxall in London.
Stock markets around the world have plunged following President Donald Trump's announcement of those new trade tariffs. The Dow Jones closed down nearly 4%.
Welcome back. Donald Trump pledged these tariffs would make America wealthy again. Well, now we've not heard from the US president today, but on Truth Social this morning, there was this post, albeit a little cryptic, stating the operation is over, the patient lived, ending on Make America Great Again.
The Trump administration team have been busy selling the president's plan across US media today. Let's have a listen.
We know people are struggling. We're fighting as quickly as we can to fix what was left to us, but it's not going to happen immediately. But we really do believe that if we pursue the right deregulation, we pursue those energy cost-reducing policies, yes, people are going to see it in their pocketbook. They're also going to benefit from the fact that foreign countries can't take advantage of us anymore. That means their jobs are going to be more secure.
They won't take our corn in India. They won't take our beef almost anywhere. It's unbelievable. They won't take our agricultural products. They just treat us badly because we've allowed them to treat us badly. And when you finally go back at them and say, this has got to end, it's going to be tough for them because they've built their whole social network, their whole economies on basically exploiting America. And Donald Trump has said, it's time for America to change that. It's going to be difficult for them to change that, but eventually America is going to be treated fairly, and the production of American factories is going to be incredibly strong growth.
Yeah. The Commerce Secretary and the Vice President there speaking earlier, just a sample of some of Team Trump who've been out selling the president's plan in the last few hours. Well, we're joined now by Kimberly Clausing. She's professor at UCLA and former Treasury official in the Biden administration. Kimberly, thanks for being with us. Let's start by talking a little maths for a moment, because there seems to be great confusion right around the world as to how President Trump and his team arrived at these various extra tariff figures, taking into account only trade balances when it comes to products and not services. Can you see the logic in what they've done here?
I, like many economists, see zero logic associated with their tariff approach. And what really struck me by the announcement yesterday was how deceptive and misleading it was. He's labeling these numbers that he is explaining as if they were foreign trade barriers, when all those numbers really are is the trade deficit with that country divided by the amount of exports that that country sent to the United States. That has no bearing whatsoever on how much protection there was. It could simply indicate, for instance, that some country is making something that we don't make, right? And so we're buying a lot of that from them, and maybe they don't want what we're selling, but that doesn't need to imply a trade barrier. So it's a completely incoherent and misleading invocation of this concept of reciprocity. These are not reciprocal tariffs.
And when you hear the Commerce Secretary there saying that many countries won't take American beef or American agricultural produce, and we heard the President say that yesterday as well, how are they linking that, which actually has more to do, say in the case of the EU, with food and safety requirements and things that are allowed to be used in farming in the US that are prohibited in the EU? How do they factor that in and coming out with this tariff number?
They don't factor it in. They have this extremely simplistic number that they've generated from a very simple formula that has nothing to do with the underlying problem. And then they're rhetorically using cherry-picked examples of particular trade practices that other countries are doing that they disapprove of. If they focused more narrowly on those practices and said, okay, we don't like that you're not taking our beef, we're not going to take your beef, that would be a more sensible response. But instead, they're using the rhetoric of one or two flashy examples and a completely nonsensical formula that has nothing to do with the underlying problem to slap on tariffs that are higher than we've seen in this country since the early parts of the 20th century, and much bigger increase than we saw under Smoot-Hawley. This is going to be the largest tax increase in a generation, more than a generation, for United States consumers.
So based on what you've said there, when the president and his team say, if you remove your tariffs, we'll remove these new tariffs, it would seem like that's not even possible because the tariffs being levied by those nations don't equal this number that the Trump administration has come up with.
Absolutely. That's crystal clear. And another thing that's been reported today is that even in internal White House talking points, they've said that these aren't particularly negotiable. So I suspect that these tariffs are with us to stay. But even if countries eliminated all their trade barriers, they might still have a trade surplus with the United States if they're making goods that we want more than we're making goods that they want. And that would imply that these types of nonsensical tariff schedules would stay in place. So it's a somewhat dismaying and disheartening chapter in American economic history, and it's going to do a lot of damage.
So if they do stay in place, how do you calculate that damage that it's going to cause to the American economy and to American people?
Yeah, so there's different ways in which this damage is going to enter in. Let's take consumers first. This is going to be a multi-$1,000 hit to the budget of a typical American family. They're going to see their costs increase by thousands of dollars. When you give a big tax increase, and it's a regressive tax increase too, it has a bigger burden on those in the middle class and the poor. When you do that size tax increase, you reduce the amount of demand in the economy and you create recessionary pressure right there. In addition to that strong, large consumption tax, there's the problem on the production side of the economy. A majority of our imports are actually intermediate goods that we use to produce goods and services in the United States. If we want to sell our goods around the world, we need to be able to make them in a competitive way that's cost competitive with what firms can do if they're based in other countries. But U.S. firms will be facing a much higher cost of their inputs than their competitors will abroad. So this is going to hurt U.S. firms in the world marketplace, and that's even before we get to retaliation. Canada, the EU, China, and others have announced major retaliation against the United States. That will also shrink U.S. export markets, and so we're going to see contraction from that mechanism as well. It's going to be a very difficult period for the U.S. economy. It could easily provoke a recession.
Okay, well, that is quite a grim picture indeed that you're painting there, Kimberly. Kimberly Clausing, professor at UCLA and former Treasury official in the Biden administration. Thanks for joining us here on BBC News.
My pleasure.
Well, the Reuters news agency is on a roll with a whole load of quotes from Donald Trump. Let's just pick a couple for you. Donald Trump saying that he would consider a deal where China approves the TikTok sale in exchange for relief from those very high tariffs that they're facing. That's because the parent company, the Chinese parent company ByteDance that owns TikTok, have been told to sort out a sale. He's also saying that Elon Musk can stay as long as he likes in the Department for Government Efficiency, but he may depart very shortly. There were all sorts of reports circulating yesterday that Elon Musk would be heading back to his businesses. Donald Trump says he can stay as long as he wants. Well, our panel are still with us, Doug Heye and Joel Rubin. Joel, what will you be keeping an eye on regarding tariffs over the coming week?
Well, Martine, I think the big question, per what Kimberly said a moment ago, is the retaliatory tariffs that are coming our way. The blowback, it's not going to be something that we'll see in a single press conference because there are 170 plus countries around the world that are going to be thinking about this, and 60 in particular. But we're going to see it, and we're going to see blowback. And I think for the American people, this is now going to be a question of what kind of response we will be making and communicating to our elected officials. You know, it's a very curious moment because from a political perspective, Democrats just had a big win on Tuesday night, cut into Donald Trump's margin in Florida, won in Wisconsin. He now enacts a tax policy, a tariff tax policy that's going to cost Americans right directly in their pocketbook. And then we're going to get more waves of hits from abroad. So I think the reaction is what we'll ultimately need to be looking at. But in the near term, these retaliatory tariffs, I think, are going to be very significant. And it's something we have to make sure we're watching very closely.
And Doug, what about you? What are you keeping an eye on over the next few days?
Well, it's largely the same thing. What is the reaction that we hear from countries throughout the world, not just our allies, but our at least quasi-adversaries? What do they do in response? And how do the American people ultimately view this? We have to remember this is the beginning of this process. I mean, you could argue certainly that it's already begun with Mexico and Canada. We've seen so many videos of from whether it's politicians in Canada or grocery stores not carrying certain American goods. But yesterday was really the big bang of all of this, and what the reactions are going to be. I think we can extrapolate that a lot of them, at least in the short term, are going to be negative. Certainly the president and the vice president are trying to brace people that there will be pain in the short term, and usually that's not a winning argument if you're a politician. Hey, hang on, things are bad right now, typically doesn't do you very well in American politics.
Doug and Joel, for the moment, stay with us, but thank you. Let's move on to another world of spending from tariffs, because the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Brussels meeting NATO countries, and he's told them he wants them to commit spending of 5% of their incomes on defence. Perhaps a slightly delicate meeting off the back of President Trump's tariff announcement and broader big shifts in the Trump administration's approach to NATO and security.
But Secretary Marco Rubio has sought to reassure the NATO member states that the US is not turning away from the alliance.
That the United States is in NATO. We are active. As we speak right now, the United States is as active in NATO as it has ever been. And some of this hysteria and hyperbole that I see in the global media and some domestic media in the United States about NATO is unwarranted.
Let's bring in our panel here. Joel, you've been at plenty of these big gatherings of allies like this. How awkward do you think things will have been today with the US trying to forge a defence alliance with NATO members, notwithstanding the potential damage that it's done to that in the last few weeks on the back of this announcement from the president yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, for the secretary, the question is on what ground is he standing? You know, where does he come from when it comes to saying those statements? I mean, only a month ago or so, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that Ukraine would not be part of NATO. We had the vice president lashing out at the Europeans. We have the president essentially strong-arming Denmark over Greenland and Canada as well, NATO allies. You know, I think that Secretary of State, you know, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I think his heart is in the right place, and I think he has the right point there. But he's kind of isolated inside this administration when it comes to NATO. And so if you're at that meeting and around that table, you're looking at him and thinking, is he really speaking for the president? Or is he just sort of putting a nice sheen on a policy that really is coming directly at us and the whole stability structure that we NATO provide for Europe and for the world?
Doug, could NATO members be forgiven for being a little confused about how committed the United States is to NATO? Marco Rubio sounded very reassuring. We want to be part of the alliance, but it's been very precarious of late.
Yeah, confusion, I think, is probably the right, or skepticism is probably the right tone to take here. And ultimately, it's because I would argue in politics, there's no such thing as mixed messages. A mixed message is a negative message, because if you're not 100% positive and you give any sign that there may be wavering, that's a problem for those that you're working with. They then view you more skeptically. And we know with Donald Trump, we've seen this so many times, that people who speak for him are not necessarily on terra firma, because Donald Trump could change his mind while they're speaking, after they're speaking, the next day, the next week. You just never really know. And our allies all know that. Everybody who Rubio met with, even if they say to each other, Rubio has said and done the right thing, they know ultimately the decision maker is the president, and that those decisions could change at any moment.
Doug and Joel, for the moment, thank you. Stay with us, though. Plenty more to come around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News.
Between the 16th century BC and 12th century AD, the longest lasting Andean civilization developed near Lake Titicaca, which is located in the Andes Mountains on the border of Bolivia and Peru. However, it disappeared suddenly and mysteriously.
Los restos arqueológicos de la cultura Tiwanaku están expandidos en 4 países actuales. La más sostenida es una crisis ambiental que ha generado una sequía prolongada. Se han sacrificado alrededor de 19 jóvenes que consideramos que fueron parte de una ofrenda para enviar el mensaje y llamar las lluvias a los dioses tutelares que tenían los Tiwanaku.
Original global stories from the BBC.
Finally tonight, we want to bring you a little update on a story that we're following closely here on The Context. We just referred to it a moment ago. We're rapidly approaching April the 5th, the day that President Trump said there would be a deal on the sale of the social media app TikTok. Users have been told the app will be banned unless it's sold by its parent company, Chinese-owned ByteDance. Well, Reuters are reporting that the president says they're close to a deal with multiple investors involved.
Now, the app, of course, went dark for US users on the 19th of January, but was reinstated just hours later, with President Trump signing an executive order once he came back into office, delaying both the sale and the ban for 75 days, pending a review, which brings us to this week and that looming deadline. Now, Vice President J.D. Vance told Fox News this morning that he believed the administration was going to have a deal on the sale of TikTok by this weekend, and President Trump has repeated that again in the last few moments. Let's get a quick view from our panel here on this. Doug, the president had previously floated the idea of the administration of the US holding a 50% stake in TikTok after any deal would be done. Is that a good idea?
You know, the most honest answer I can give you is not only do I know if that's a good idea, I don't know what's going to happen. What we've seen so often is various machinations from Donald Trump on this and talking about we're going to get a deal and here's the deadline, and the deal extended and the deal extended. Clearly, there's a lot of angst in Congress about Chinese ownership of TikTok. They want to see a resolution to this, but what ultimately happens, I honestly think, is anyone's guess.
Joel, how relieved, though, will users be if there is a deal and that the pushback by the Chinese is overcome?
Well, you know, Martine, I won't be relieved. I have 3 teenage daughters, and I don't want any deal. I want my daughters back. You know, if it goes through, they're gone. You know, and so that's partially true, of course. But yeah, I think users do want TikTok. There are legitimate security concerns. I could make another joke about Signalgate and the Signal app. Perhaps the government should be looking into that and its use as well. I do think there will be some kind of deal, though. There's just too much public interest in and support for the use of TikTok. And Congress put in a hard bill, stop it, shut it down. And if we can get it resuscitated in a way that is secure, I think that's a good thing. And I think that the American people will be happy, even if I'll be very sad.
Let's see some TikTok dance moves from you, Joel, no? Let's save that for the Friday show. But Doug, it kind of shows in a way that everything we're talking about at the moment is all interlinked. I mean, mentioning Signalgate there, and also President Trump had mentioned last week, and he said it again today, that potentially, you know, if the deal goes through, that he would reduce tariffs on China in some kind of negotiating, which we're also hearing there is to be no negotiating.
Yeah, and look, one of the things that we know about TikTok is the Trump campaign was able to use it extremely effectively. And I'm old enough to remember when Republicans were really behind in the tech battle with Democrats. Trump and his team utilized TikTok extremely well. I think it's one of the reasons that we see Donald Trump trying to sort something out here is because it's been a platform that worked very well for him. If it's something that he doesn't think has worked well for him, we obviously know that he's more than happy to throw them at the wolves at any time.
Joel, it will be interesting to find out if this deal goes through, who those multiple investors are. which parts of business they come from? Because there's clearly a lot of influence to be had if you own a platform like this.
Yeah, I have a feeling a lot of those folks are camping out at Mar-a-Lago and have been for a number of months. And that's, of course, one of the underneath the surface concerns is that maybe he's just going to move TikTok over to some more of his friends and, per Doug's point, try to exert more influence over Silicon Valley and the tech industry as a result, which, of course, would be very dangerous for our democracy.
And Doug, just speaking about the kind of influence that these platforms have, and you're saying there that the Republican Party have become better at using them, are we going to see a kind of, outreach in whatever kind of battle is coming up about votes with the impact of the tariffs regime, trying to appeal to the American people more and more through these sort of platforms like we saw with the election?
Sure, that's going to be a very effective way for politicians as we're coming into the midterm elections to do so. And let's also remember, TikTok is not the final platform. There will be more things like TikTok or versions of which we can't even imagine yet. AI is going to have a tremendous impact on that as well. So we're talking about this dominant platform now, the way we used to talk about Twitter, the way we used to talk about Facebook or MySpace or things on down in the past. There will be new TikToks as well. It's just clear that this is the dominant one right now.
Something else for Joel to fret about with his daughters. Doug Heye and Joel Rubin, thanks very much.
The future.
Thank you.
Stay with us on BBC News.